Thank you very much, Ali. Great to have everyone here. And great to have Peter back. A lot of you are some of our great and wonderful longtime members. We've had Peter in different capacities multiple times. You've covered, I think, every president since Clinton. Ali mentioned a great book on the Bush-Cheney White House, which some of you may have come for a few years ago. The last time we hosted you, because of COVID, it had to be virtual for a lot of times what people consider maybe the most impressive statesman in the Republican Party, especially in terms of foreign policy and as a chief of staff, James Baker. Tonight, we're going to have a discussion about another Republican leader, but in some ways, a very different, ilk or I suppose impression of James Baker. This book is fascinating. I'm so glad you all will get it. And as we mentioned, they all are signed. If not, just let it know. We'll get another one signed. I think what is excellent about this book is a great historical chronicle of everything that happened inside this administration, and it's with over 300 different interviews, of virtually interviews with the highest levels, the mid-levels, every level of person involved, almost all of them Republicans, almost all of them appointed by Trump himself, selected by himself. He might have denigrated them later, but these were his own people. Can you maybe just talk about the fact of why it just started out from the very beginning, besides just maybe his own style of being rather chaotic? For any of you who came when we hosted Sean Spicer a few years ago, some of it comes from the fact that Spicer would say, we knew we had a chance to win. They had different polling, which is more accurate, to tell the truth, and we're just looking at key states when everyone's looking at national polling. But they're still rather surprised that it actually happened. And maybe in some ways, the fact that they weren't really thinking they could win created a huge, enormous problem that you win an election, you don't have people in place, you don't have a plan, and you've got less than 2 months to fill an administration.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be here. I have now done the World Affairs Council of Houston enough times. I feel like I should have associate membership. I don't know if that's okay. I don't want to climb Kilimanjaro if that's okay. I'm not really up for that. But I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Marianne. Where is she? Ali, thank you for that great introduction. A congressman I used to cover would get up in moments like that and say, we have here our guest who deserves no introduction, which is his way of introducing people. To your point, where are our students? Are students still here? I learned something from them earlier today. They are both wonderful. Shane brought them to meet with me. They are heading to the National Debate Championships in Phoenix in a couple months. They're very impressive. I asked them, what's the key to being a good debater? And they said, be confident, even if you're wrong. And I thought, that's pretty good for journalism too, by the way. It's definitely true for politics. And that kind of leads us to your question. They were confident even when they were wrong. They did not think he was going to win. Sean Spicer may have told you that, but the truth is Sean Spicer was one of the people who was backgrounding reporters just before Election Day to explain how they were going to lose. And then suddenly they were shocked on election night to discover that they did not lose. And in fact, Donald Trump didn't want to do anything to prepare for possibly winning. There was no transition effort of any note that he was willing to be part of. The one that he had authorized by Chris Christie, his friend, the governor of New Jersey, was tossed out the minute the election happened, and Christie unceremoniously fired. So you're right, they had to put a government together.
You might mention why Christie was pushed out.
Well, most people may know the story. Chris Christie had been a prosecutor and, of course, had prosecuted none other than Jared Kushner's own father and put him in prison. So Jared Kushner, not surprisingly, didn't want Chris Christie having anything to do with it. And that's the nature of this. I mean, that in itself encapsulated this White House, in which you had on the one hand a son-in-law, and on the other hand a really good friend who had prosecuted the son-in-law's father, and somehow they're all in the same room sitting around, supposedly on the same team. And in fact, they weren't on the same team. Nobody was on the same team in this White House. It was the most ruthless, cutthroat, knife-fighting White House you ever saw. And you mentioned the transition. That is very clear. In our book, we tell the story, for instance, of interviewing people who were going to come work for that White House, people who actually wanted to do what they thought was the right thing for the country, public service-minded people. And they would be interviewed by Reince Priebus or Jared Kushner or Steve Bannon. And the real question they would be asked in these interviews are, whose side are you going to be on? My side or the other guy's side in this tribal knife fight that we're already having in a White House that hasn't even taken office yet? So you got from the very beginning a sense of what it's going to be like.
Even, I think in a lot of ways, really, we should probably be appreciative of a large number of these people who served at the highest levels, whether it be Secretary Mattis or later Secretary Esper, or both Joint Chiefs of Staff, especially in the end, Milley. Can you talk about how it was that once they reached the conclusion that this was madness, and they have a very erratic president, and especially the military people in the defense were really concerned, we'll get to it later, towards the end of the presidency, but some very rash, dangerous, erratic action could happen to maybe even start a war. The dilemma they faced of, do you leave, do you resign, or do you quietly stay and take the abuse, take the press calling you, a sellout, how can you go along with all of this, when a lot of them were actually trying from the inside to kind of manage the chaos?
Yeah. It was really interesting. When the administration first came in, to be in Washington meant you would go to dinner parties or have lunches or have conversations with your Republican friends and Republican sources, and they all were struggling with this question. What is your responsibility as a good Republican who might not necessarily support Donald Trump? Do you have a responsibility to the country to go in and take these jobs, even though he might not be your kind of person, even though you might not agree with him, even though you might think he is not particularly admirable, in order to, serve the country, to guide him, maybe to teach him? There was this feeling about a lot of people who took jobs early on that Trump was teachable, that, he could be steered in the right direction, that a lot of the bombastic, showmanship of the campaign trail was really just about the campaign. And once he got in office, it would mature him. He would take it seriously because big things were at stake, and that they could go in and be guides to him. And in the end, of course, that was a major miscalculation. That was basically not true for 4 years. And so many of them came to this moment of, where is my red line? Where is the line beyond which I cannot stay here because I find it too repugnant to be here? I find this person who's president to be somebody I cannot support. Versus, if I leave, who will stop him from doing something that I, the person, this is not me, this is them talking, feel is immoral, unethical, illegal, unwise, erratic, dangerous, what have you. And this was a struggle. Almost every single person we interviewed for this book seemed to have come to at some point or another, except for the true believers. There were the true believers who thought Trump was great, and obviously they didn't have then this conundrum. But the other Republicans who didn't think he was great, who thought he was erratic and all of that, inevitably come up to that moment. When is the moment I can't do it any further, at the risk that the person behind me coming afterwards will be different and more malleable? And we saw that happen time and time again. The people he brought in, you mentioned Secretary Mattis, you mentioned people like General Kelly. Trump didn't know these people. He was told he should hire these people. He agreed to hire these people. And then he found himself very frustrated with these people because they were not, in fact, willing to do what he wanted them to do. They slow-walked him. They argued with him. They tried to talk him out of things because they disagreed. Now, you can argue that's not necessarily a healthy thing in a democratic society, that the president is the one who makes decisions and the people around him should carry it out. But there was this feeling that this was somehow a different situation, that he was going to put the country at risk and that he needed wiser heads around him. But the wiser heads, the axis of adults, as we call them in the book, found that he wasn't interested in listening to them. And over time, you would see a progression of people being fired again and again and again. And the ones who would take their places inevitably would be more Trumpian, more agreeable, more on his side. And therefore, the consequences became greater.
And you mentioned, especially early on, a lot of high-level generals in impressive positions: Secretary of Defense Mattis, General Kelly as his chief of staff, Mike Flynn originally, and then soon after General McMaster as his national security advisor. It's a bit humorous, but it's also quite disconcerting. But can you tell the kind of the brief story of Trump talking about my generals and loyalty, and asking, I believe it was at the time, General Kelly, with regards to the German generals of World War II?
Yeah. I mean, with Trump was fascinated with generals. He admired, respected, idolized them, and the idea that generals, these 4 stars, people like Patton, who he thought was really the greatest ever, would be working for him was extraordinary. They're my generals. He used that phrase all the time, my generals. Well, they're not his generals, really. They're all of our generals, right? They don't serve him. The military is not meant to be a political institution. And they resented this. They resented this my generals idea. And he didn't really understand our modern military. A lot of people here probably served. The modern military is not about serving political partisan goals. The modern military is about serving the country and serving the commander-in-chief in an apolitical way. And when he discovered that these generals were not what he thought they were going to be, not going to be the susceptible to his charms, were not willing to cross lines that they had been spending a whole lifetime and career upholding, he became quite upset about it, very upset about it. And he kept ranting about it. He would rant about it to John Kelly, who was himself a 4-star Marine general, retired, who lost a son in Afghanistan, who gave to his country, and who kept telling him again and again, no, sir, you can't do that. That's illegal. No, sir, you can't do that. That's just wrong. And it's finally this moment where he erupts at them and says, why can't you generals be like the German generals? He says, well, what are you talking about, the German generals? The ones in World War II. He's talking about Hitler's generals. Why can't you be like Hitler's generals? And John Kelly says, well, they tried to kill him 3 times. No, he says, no, they were loyal. That was his idea of loyalty. The German generals in World War II, which shocked John Kelly. And you ask about people having to make these decisions about staying. For John Kelly, that's a moment. Do I stay and work for somebody who thinks that? Or is it more dangerous if I leave?
There have been many presidents who kind of had relatively low levels of experience, especially in terms of foreign policy, before they became president. Obviously, Barack Obama, Bush 43. But as you note in the book, Trump had never held any political office before, had a very poor understanding of Washington, and perhaps maybe even just had a very poor understanding of the Constitution itself. Do you think his kind of obsession with power and authority was a legitimate misunderstanding of him, or 2 of the kind of more frightening quotes, these are his own words, is regards to the Constitution and the presidency. He said the authority is total, and as president, quote unquote, I have the right to do whatever I want. Do you think that was really a poor understanding of the Constitution, or he just didn't really care?
Can it be both? Well, look, you're right to say this is the first president in our history who had not spent a single day in either political or military service. Not one day. Every other president had been in the military, had been in public office in some fashion or other. He hadn't. So he didn't come in with a deep understanding of how government worked, how politics worked, how the Constitution worked. Now, that doesn't necessarily, mean you can't learn, right? A lot of people who've never been in politics or the military can learn pretty quickly. But he didn't show any signs of it being interested in learning. Where did he come from? He came from a business that was a family business. No shareholders, right? No board of directors, nobody to answer to, just him on the 25th floor or whatever it is of Trump Tower saying, do this, do that, and then they listened or they didn't listen, as the case may be. He had never been in an organization with a checks and balances kind of system, right? Like a Congress, like courts, like regulations, like rules, all those kinds of things. And it just bothered him. He just hated it. I was on the flight with him coming back on Air Force One from Buenos Aires one time. It had been a summit down there, and he just had dinner with Xi Jinping, the Chinese president. He comes back to the press cab, and he's sitting there talking about it, and he's mulling about it. He says, he was waxing envious of Xi Jinping. If he wants to put somebody on trial for fentanyl abuse, he puts them on trial, and they could execute him the next day. No courts, no appeals, right? He doesn't have a Congress to deal with. He doesn't have an FEC or an FCC or a SEC or any of these alphabet soup agencies that he has to listen to or answer to. They could do what they want. And that's what Trump thought he ought to be able to do, that he was too constrained. Now, every president to some extent feels that way. Just they don't necessarily look at Xi Jinping as a model. You know what I mean? I've heard Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama all express frustrations with the limitations of the office, and it's true. It can be really frustrating if you have to wait for 535 people on Capitol Hill to agree to do anything. No question about it. I get that. But all of those other presidents understood that was the system, and that was, the way we designed it, as frustrating as it might be. And they looked for ways to get around it with their executive power, but they didn't actually think that was the Chinese model was the way we were supposed to go. And that's the way Trump thought.
And, as you detail in the book, especially with people who knew him and knew him for a long time, a lot of this, the degree to which he took it might have been a surprise, but the tendencies were not. I think it's an interesting anecdote with one of the most impressive world leaders of the last 20 years, Angela Merkel. Her staff, maybe you can let them know, went back to an interview Trump had with Playboy in 1990, so basically at that stage, 26 years ago, almost 3 decades ago. And in that article, it summed up what she was going to have to face. Yeah. He said, our allies are screwing us. I respect what the Chinese did when they put down Tiananmen Square. Can you maybe talk about what it was in terms of the reality of this ideology of his? It was not new. It had been shaped a long time ago, and how world leaders dealt with it.
Yeah, that's a great question. It will not surprise this audience to know that Angela Merkel does her homework, right? So she's going to meet Donald Trump. What does she do? She reads Playboy. Okay. It is true that Angela Merkel does read the magazine for the articles. That's true. So this interview in 1990 was very revealing, she thought, because it did say some of the things that Ronan just talked about. In other words, the worldview. He doesn't have an ideology. He doesn't have a philosophy per se. He's been a Democrat, a Republican, a Reform Party member, an independent of this and that. He's not tethered to anything particularly. He's a very ideologically flexible person, let's say. But he does have a worldview, and the worldview is everybody out there is shafting us. Right? Our friends are shafting us, our enemies are shafting us, we are weak. And he's had that view going back to the 1980s when he talked about how Ronald Reagan wasn't strong enough and how Mikhail Gorbachev wasn't strong enough, and how, in fact, as Ronan said, that the Chinese were right to go ahead and put the troops in Tiananmen Square. And this idea, at the time, he was mostly focused on the Japanese, how they were eating our lunch in trade. Years later, he substituted the Chinese for the Japanese. They basically become the same, villains to him that the Japanese had been in the 80s when they bought Rockefeller Center and all that. And this idea that everybody out there is out to get us on security, on trade, on everything, animated his presidency to the point where, why are we in NATO? Somebody mentions to him that, we have an Article 5 responsibility to protect our allies. You mean if the Russians attack Lithuania, we have to go to war? He said. Yes, sir. He said, so that's nuts. Now, a lot of people in America might agree with that, by the way, right? That is a question, fair enough, but it is our treaty obligation, and it has been the fundamental bedrock of our relationship with Russia going back to 1948, and he didn't even understand that. Back when he was with the Baltic leaders, he kept referring to them as the Balkan leaders without realizing that was not the same thing. He really didn't know a lot about almost everything. That was actually a line I think we quote that from John Kelly in there. He knew very little about almost everything. And he did not know the difference between the Baltics and the Balkans. At one point he asked, how do I declare war? Well, okay, you don't. That's what Congress does. He just didn't even seem interested in learning, which is the frustration of the people around him who were trying to guide him.
I just want to get into, you've touched upon some of it already, but just foreign policies. World Affairs Council, we'll bring it back to the, more of the domestic issues at the close of the presidency, which are obviously quite concerning. But the issue of Russia obviously was concerning months and months before he was elected. The meeting, obviously, in New York. And then later, obviously, there were the issues with Mike Flynn and all of that going on. But there are probably very few journalists, I can't think of many, who have such incredible experience in Russia. Kremlin Rising, incredible book on Putin that you wrote. That was really, in some ways, ahead of its time in 2008, saying this is going in the wrong direction. This is autocratic president, and it's only going to get worse. So you understand Putin well, and you obviously have come to understand Trump and everyone around him well. What's surprising, and I assume the first time I'm aware of in American history, is people within his own administration, his own director of national intelligence, Dan Coates, our highest ranking intelligence official, was legitimately asking and was uncertain, does Putin have something on him? What do you think was the basis of Trump's refusal to ever say even a tiny negative word or even kind of question anything Putin would say?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it is, it's a question we address in the book. I'm not sure we have the final answer. I suspect historians for generations to come will be writing about that very question. What was the real nature of his relationship with Russia? Why did it seem so odd and out of the norm, both Democratic and Republican presidents going back 4 decades or more? The anecdote you mentioned is an important one. He is in Helsinki standing next to Vladimir Putin, in which he says, basically, I accept Vladimir Putin's denial that the Russians did anything wrong in the 2016 election, in effect trusting the Russian president over his own intelligence agencies. And Dan Coates is watching this on television. Dan Coates, by the way, not a liberal. This guy, former chief of staff to Dan Quayle, former United States senator, Republican from Indiana, former ambassador to Germany for George W. Bush, pretty strong, solid conservative guy. He's watching this on television thinking to himself, my God, what do the Russians have on him? Maybe Putin does have something on him. And this guy has access to all of our secrets, right? If their secrets exist in the United States government, Dan Coates had access to it. And even he thought there was something really strange and disturbing about this. Very telling and important. And it was a one-way street, though. Like, Putin, it wasn't exactly sucking up to Trump. There was this meeting in Osaka, Japan, G20 meeting, and Putin and Trump have a sidebar meeting, just the two of them. And it's closed door, the press. I'm not in there. I was at Osaka, but I wasn't in the room. And Trump goes in and he's doing this Trump thing, very braggadocio, hey, the Poles love me so much, Vladimir, they're going to name a fort after me, Fort Trump. And the Israelis love me so much, Vladimir, they're going to name a whole settlement in the Golan Heights after me, Trump Heights. And Putin, who has his number, kind of looks at him and says, kind of in this droll, and Putin's like this, right? He's always like, he has this droll answer. He says, well, maybe, Donald, they'll just name all of Israel after you. Right? He's mocking Trump's own pretensions and narcissism because he knows who he is. He gets it. And so why then this unusual admiration by an American president of this autocratic Russian leader? We still don't know the answer. Michael Cohen, who was his fixer, his lawyer for many years, he says, look, it's all about money. It's really money. He wanted to build a tower in Moscow for 35 years, hundreds of millions of dollars. Who do you suck up to build a tower? This is what he did in New York and every other city in the world he built. He suck up to the local power structure. That would be Vladimir Putin. His son said repeatedly in the past, we got money from the Russians when the American banks stopped lending to them. Right? They sold all these really overpriced Miami condos to Russians for millions, tens of millions of dollars. So there's a money aspect of it. If you ask the national security staff who worked for them, who worked for Trump, hadn't been with him during business, their answer would be he just loves strongmen. He just loves autocrats. It's just part of who he is. He loves Xi Jinping and Duterte and the Philippines and Erdogan and Turkey and Sisi. He called Sisi, the president of Egypt, comes into his office. My favorite dictator, he says when he comes into his office. And it's just the guy, his viewpoint growing up from his father was strong is the only adjective that matters. Strong. His father liked to say, you're a killer. And killer to him was a compliment, right? Killer was the ultimate compliment, and that's his national security team's theory of the case. But the truth is we don't really know, and I think it's still an enduring mystery, even despite the Mueller report, which does not say he didn't have a relationship with Russia. It only says it wasn't a crime.
To kind of move on towards the election and kind of where your book, the last third or so of the book goes. Sadly, by March, April 2020, the whole world was suffering direly from COVID-19. His own political advisors, campaign advisors, and Trump himself were coming to realize, forget the economy, forget the Middle East, forget Russia. The number one issue for this election is going to be how you handle COVID. But to even a lot of his kind of Republican supporters for a long time, it was hard to understand his response to COVID. Can you talk about that? How he took something like masks, which are kind of a scientific issue that maybe they had wrong at first one way or the other, but turned it into a political issue. He should be given an enormous amount of credit for Operation Warp Speed and developing a vaccine very quickly. But then even when he received his own vaccine, he did it quietly, privately with Melania. There was no video cameras. There was no public service announcement to say to the country, especially to his base, those tens of millions of people, hey, I got the vaccine. It's safe. This will help save lives. Can you explain really how probably his biggest political failing was how he handled COVID?
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, that's probably the number one reason he loses the election, right? Is the country was just in this horrible place. Now, it would have been in a horrible place with any other president. Let's just face that, right? That's fair enough. Any president would have struggled to deal with this particular challenge. But his own people think that he struggled with it so much that he made it worse, right? Dr. Deborah Birx said the first 100,000 deaths were almost going to be inevitable, but after that, they were a result of the way Trump handled it. In her mind, it made things much worse. And she worked for him, right? She was his COVID coordinator. It's not me saying that; it's her saying that. There's this anecdote early in the COVID pandemic that I think is really telling. He calls Chris Christie, coming back to our first part of the conversation. He says, "Come on down here. You've dealt with big disasters. I need your help." Christie says, "Okay." He gets in the car. He says, "Drive." He's not going to take the train. Nobody's flying. Gets in the car, drive down. On the drive down, the phone rings. It's Melania. She says, "I know you're coming to see him. You have to be brutally honest with him. He is not getting it. He is not getting it." She tells Christie, "I talked to him on the plane coming back from India. This is the last trip he took before the lockdown." And she said that she told her husband, quote, "You're blowing it. You're blowing it." And so Christie goes into the Oval Office and he's trying to get through to him, and Trump is just not really listening. And I think that the real answer is that Trump needs an enemy, right? He needs an enemy. He thrives on having an enemy. Hillary Clinton, great enemy. Democrats, great enemy. The media, great enemy. The disease, oh, that's kind of hard, right? Because a virus doesn't respond to a mean tweet. It doesn't care if you give it a bad nickname, right? It's the one thing that the thing that had made him most successful in politics, this idea of us versus them and capitalizing on that, didn't work. You can't browbeat a pandemic into listening to you. And so he was out of his league. He was out of his depth in terms of how to handle it. And he didn't want to listen to the people who told him to handle it. So what did he do? He made it into an us and them thing. Right? Red states versus blue states. Hey, the country's doing great if you don't count the blue states, he said at one point. As if we just don't care about half the country. Too bad, your problem. He just can't help it. That's just the way he's wired. So the masks become a partisan issue. Vaccines ultimately become a partisan issue. The vaccine is a remarkable thing. You rightly said that he can legitimately claim credit, at least some credit, for the development of the vaccine. Now, he didn't develop, he's not a scientist, but he put in money early on to help the companies max out so they would be ready the minute the vaccine was ready to start mass producing it. A remarkably important decision on his part. And yet, why doesn't he claim credit for it? This is really interesting. When we went and saw this book 2 times. First time, he told us it was March or April, I think, of 2021. He just left office. He was bragging about the vaccine at that point. It was just being distributed. And he said, yeah, they're asking me to do a PSA about it, a public service announcement for who's asking the Biden administration. Oh, okay. Which makes sense because it was his people who were most concerned, right? Most nervous about it. And if he got up and said, hey guys, this is a great thing, you should take it, a lot of them might listen to him, right? So of course, people would want him to make a public announcement about that. Fast forward 7 months to November, we come back for our second interview. The first thing we asked him, hey sir, how come you never did that PSA for the vaccine you said you were going to do? What do you mean a PSA for a vaccine? I was never going to do that. Nobody ever asked me to do that. Where'd you get that from? Well, you. You were the one who told us that, which also tells you about Trump's fidelity to the truth. He can't even keep his own statements straight. He's going to contradict you from one interview to the next. But why did he suddenly distance himself from the vaccine so strongly? Because in fact, he got booed at a rally when he told people the vaccine was a good thing. So we talk about how he has his command over his base, which I think is true. But the base also has command over him, right? He is to some extent a hostage of his own political success. And he's afraid of crossing the base. He was afraid of crossing the base on vaccines. He was also afraid of crossing Fox News at times. I mean, there's moments in the book you'll see where he's just clearly worried about getting too far away from the base, and it influences the way he handles things.
And just maybe to follow up something you had mentioned, the media, and I'm sure probably since George Washington, maybe he had a honeymoon, but almost every single American president, regardless of party, has had their issues with the media, whether it's Democrat or Republican. Obviously, LBJ and then later Nixon both had enormous problems with the media. Nixon going into paranoia about the media, but the level of hatred and vitriol that was created and directed towards what are considered left of center organizations like yourself, like the New York Times or Washington Post. There were journalists who were legitimately had to be afraid. At rallies, they had to be marked off and protected. He used the term, like you mentioned, enemy of the people. That was created by Stalin, and it was Khrushchev, like you mentioned in the book, who said in a private meeting to the Soviet leadership, this was a term used by Stalin because once you had labeled someone with that, no ideology was needed, no proof was needed, any action or oppression or violence taken against them was legitimate. What was it like as a journalist and for your fellow journalists to be labeled an enemy of the people and have legitimate concerns sometimes about your safety?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're right to say that they all hate us. Just okay to start with that. Ali mentioned, I think, that I've covered 5 presidents. None of them like me. Okay? And none of them like the press. They may say they do, but they don't. It's okay. We're not there to be liked. It's not our job. It's our job to tell the truth as best we can learn it. Okay? And sometimes they're going to like it, sometimes they're not. That's fine. That's fair. It's okay. It's built into the system. It's actually healthy. It's a good thing that we have an adversarial relationship between the press and the people in power because that's the whole point. Right? The whole point is accountability, transparency, information. If people don't like our stories, then they won't read them, fine, big deal. But it's our job to provide people with the information so they can make reasoned, healthy decisions in a democracy. So fine, every president hates us, and every president has been mad at me. But Trump is different. I think it is different to say enemy of the people. I think it is different to say fake news all the time because it's not just saying I don't like this story, I don't like that reporter, or I think this organization isn't very fair. What he is trying to do is undercut the very idea of an independent free media. The very idea of it. You can't trust any of it. He literally said the words at one point, you can't trust anybody but me. By the way, almost word for word, something that Vladimir Putin said a few months ago. Don't trust anybody but me. And he was asked about this by our friend Leslie Stahl one time from CBS. She said, off camera after her interview, why do you always just beat up on the reporters like that, she asked. And he says, well, you know why I do it? So that when you guys write something mean about me, nobody will believe you. Right? It's pretty straightforward. Discredit any other source of information so that nobody believes anything negative about him. I was with him once at a rally in Ohio, and he did the whole enemy of the people, all that kind of stuff. And the people get really, they get kind of worked up, and they turn around, and they're shouting at you like this, and they're red-faced, and they're screaming, CNN sucks, tell the truth. Okay, I've been been in war zones. I've been in more dangerous places than that. But it's a pretty hostile environment that he's creating, and it's intended to be that way. Then we get back on Air Force One. We're flying home from Ohio. He comes back to the press cabin. He says, "Hey, everybody, how's everybody doing? Everybody had a good time?" Right? So he can be, on the one hand, a demagogue using Stalinist language, and then a few minutes later, he's back to his hotel maitre d' style guy, right? You know, he likes to be the host. Everybody having a good time? Can I get you a Diet Coke? And I didn't bring, none of the reporters brought up, but one of the photographers, to his credit, I guess, brought up, said, "Sir, you know, you kind of gave it to us pretty hard back there." This is early on. I guess he wasn't used to it. And Trump says, "Oh, that was nothing. I could have been much harder." You know, so on some level, it's both true and it's shtick. Right? People say, "Is it true or shtick?" I think it's both. It's shtick. It's a political tool. He knows what he's doing. He's discrediting anybody who gives other information, and I think he's genuinely, viscerally angry at us quite a lot, and does hate us. I mean, okay, fair enough. What he does is he says out loud what the others thought. Right? If you go back to Nixon, you'll see in the tapes a lot of language about the press that isn't that different than what Trump said. The difference is that Nixon understood that you're not supposed to say that out loud in a free society. And I remember going in once to see Trump in the Oval Office, and I went in with A.G. Sulzberger, who was our publisher. Young guy. A.G.'s a great guy, just relatively new as a publisher at that time. I think he was probably 40. And he said, "Look, you," and I was with Maggie Haberman, my partner. He said, "You guys ask your questions, but leave me 5 minutes at the end because I'd like to say something to him." I said, "Okay, fine." We asked our questions, and they said, "You know, Mr. President, that Mr. Sulzberger would like to have a few words with you." And AG said to him, "You know, I just want to point out that when you use phrases like fake news and enemies of the people, it has a real impact, and it puts people in danger, not even here in America, but around the world." Right? Because people like Duterte, people like Sisi, people like MBS. They all start to adopt that language. And it empowers them to not just criticize the press. I got a thick skin. You can call me names. It doesn't really bother me. But in Egypt, they're going to put you in jail. In Saudi Arabia, they may hang you. You know what I mean? Like, these are real consequences for journalists around the world. This is what AG was telling President Trump. "I just want you to think," he said, "about your language and how that empowers the worst elements around the world and puts journalists we know in danger. It endangers their lives, your language." He says, "Really? Huh?" He says. "You think so? I hadn't thought about that," he says. Okay, but then a week later, he's using it all over again. So to the extent that he ever absorbed anything AG said, it clearly didn't make a difference to him in his desire how to use that language.
You know, as you highlight in the book, or any of you who attended when we hosted Secretary of Defense Esper in August, for a lot of the people at the highest levels, their concerns about the election, especially if he lost, and they were anticipating they lost, started 6, 8, 10 months well before the election. And it's kind of amazing that people within his own administration were drafting contingency plans. Maybe you could talk about some of that. Maybe, to me, one of the most dire conversations you discuss is when Speaker Pelosi called the chairman of Joint Chiefs, General Milley, who was appointed by Trump, and obviously no hardcore left-wing progressive liberal, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States, and they are discussing the safety of the nation's nuclear codes in the case things get severely dire and chaotic in the weeks after the election.
Yeah, well, this comes back to your earlier discussion about my generals, right? They're not his generals, they're our generals, they're everybody's generals. And they really worried about him. Early on, even. A good example, we don't tell this story enough, but there was a vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs named Paul Selva, a general. And he was just really concerned that Trump was so fixated on this idea of having a military parade down the streets of Washington. And he says, "Sir," he says in a meeting, "I grew up in Portugal. At the time, it was a military dictatorship. That's what they did. They had military parades down the streets." He says, "That's not what we do here," he says. "That's what dictators do." And he says that to Trump, which has absolutely no impact on him whatsoever, because he's still pushing for the parade. He's told that that's a thing a dictator does. It does not bother him. So these generals were wary of him for a long time. Milley had kind of campaigned for the job. He pushed away Jim Mattis's favorite choice, and Trump was happy to pick Milley because he thought that was a way of screwing Mattis, right? But we didn't understand who Milley really was. Milley is not a woke general, even though the right wing is trying to make him out to be. He's a tough, big, gruff guy. He did graduate from, top of his class, very smart student, Princeton, all that. But he believes in the apolitical military. And he was shocked by the Lafayette Square event. You probably remember when the president takes Milley and Secretary Esper, as well as other people, across Lafayette Square after they've cleared it out with tear gas to go to the church. That's not where a general is supposed to be. Not where a general is supposed to be. It's a political photo op. A four-star general is not supposed to be part of a president's political parade. And he was so upset about it, Milley was, that he wrote a letter of resignation. And this was known at the time. They wrote a letter they didn't send, but what was not known was what that letter said. And we have the letter in our book, the first time it's been out anywhere. And he writes in this letter to Trump, he says, I believe you are doing great harm and disservice to our country. Great harm to our country. He says, you don't understand the values that we fought World War II over. He says, you are ruining, his words, the international order. And I can't serve you any longer. It's an extraordinary letter. Covered Washington now, been a journalist for 37 years. I've never seen a letter like that from a person who's like the four-star chairman of the Joint Chiefs to a president of the United States. Extraordinary letter. Tells you something very profound. He didn't send it. He put it in a drawer. Why didn't he send it? It comes back to Ronan's very good question at the very beginning. Do I stay or do I go? I can't work for this guy, but if I go, the guy they put in after me might do what he wants him to do. All right? He puts it in the drawer. And he tells his staff, I'm going to stay and fight. I'm going to stay and fight. Those are his words. I'm going to stay and fight. Now, this is troublesome in all sorts of ways, right? We shouldn't have our four-star chairman of the Joint Chiefs feel like he has to fight the president of the United States. And, in fact, we believe strongly in the civilian leadership of the Pentagon. And you'll hear some military experts talk about how they think Milley went too far in setting himself up in opposition, in effect, to the president. What Milley would tell you is he's not trying to say he wouldn't obey a lawful order. He would. He will do what he's supposed to do as a military officer. He will salute as he's supposed to do it. But he will use whatever influence he has, he decides, to try to keep an unlawful order, or even a lawful but unwise order, from being issued. He will resist as best he can before he has to salute. And so it comes to the election, and he is very worried about the use of the military to help keep Trump in office, right? This is why January 6th happens on some level, by the way. Why is it there weren't troops at the Capitol? Why didn't they deploy the National Guard earlier? Because they were nervous. Both the military and the Democrats were nervous that if you had troops at the Capitol, they would be used by Trump for his purposes, not to defend the Capitol against Trump's people, right? So they were fighting the last war, Lafayette Square, and didn't realize they needed the troops there to protect them from the rioters, the attackers. Trump likes to say, well, I'm the one who told them they should have 10,000 troops there. I said that to Secretary Miller, who was Esper's successor, a couple days before. But what Milley has told people is, what Trump said is, you need to have 10,000 troops down there to protect my people. Not to protect the Capitol, to protect my people against Antifa and left-wing provocateurs, who, of course, were not there. And he was not concerned about the Capitol. And that's, I think, very, very telling. So Milley was there inside, in effect, so concerned. He had this conversation with Nancy Pelosi. He told the Joint Chiefs. In effect, he tells the Joint Chiefs what Secretary Schlesinger tells the military at the end of Nixon and Watergate. When Schlesinger, Secretary of Defense at the time, tells the Pentagon, do not take any orders from the president without checking with me or Secretary Kissinger first. Not that they're trying to subvert a lawful president, but they were worried that Nixon in his final days was not fully there, drinking too much, out of his mind. This is what Milley does to the Joint Chiefs. Remember our protocols, he says. You do not simply just take an order without, following our protocols. And in effect, what he's saying is, don't let him use us for his political goals. It's an extraordinary thing. That's extraordinary. And we don't, I think, pay enough attention to it.
I just maybe one question, then I want to bring it to the audience questions. In terms of where we are now, I think maybe it's pretty fair to say, two of the biggest accomplishments Trump, proclaims, and obviously they're a great achievement for a Republican president, are a big tax cut and appointing 3 conservative judges to the Supreme Court. But I think most people agree, if it had been President Cruz, if it had been President Kasich, anyone who was a Republican, those exact same things would have happened, especially when you control the House and the Senate at that time. What's maybe not talked about is why is it that the Republican Party stays with him? With someone who uses the term big loser so often, he himself is probably the biggest Republican loser in decades. His approval ratings in the history of Gallup polls never went above 50%. He basically lost 3 elections in a row, 2018, 2020, and his impact on 2022. Where is the Republican Party now? Is it still his party as he proclaims, as Donald Jr. proclaims? Or is there a fight and a struggle to reclaim what we maybe consider the Bush-Baker Republicans, the kind of more moderate, reasonable Chamber of Commerce, fiscal responsibility, basically just Republicans of yesteryear?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is the salient question for today. No question about it. And you're right to point out, like, he is a historic loser. If you look at the results of the last few years, he is the first president to lose the White House, the House, and the Senate within 4 years since Herbert Hoover. He is the first president to lose the popular vote twice in a row since Benjamin Harrison. Right? And yet, as you say, Republicans stick with him. As you rightly say, the tax cut, we actually have something in there I don't think anybody's paid attention to. We actually quote his own top tax policy guy who says Donald Trump had nothing to do with this package. It was done entirely on the Hill. That was Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, and those guys did the tax cut, and Trump showed up for the ceremony to sign it. That's Trump's own guy saying that, by the way, not some Democrat. So it's a good question. I think a lot of Republicans do like a lot of things about his presidency, in the sense that they give him credit for the economy. The economy seemed pretty good for 3 years. The 3 conservative justices, if you're pro-life, a really big deal. It may be a transactional deal, a Faustian bargain on some level. You accept a guy who's very unchristian to accomplish what you think are Christian goals, but they got rid of Roe v. Wade, which is something that they've been wanting to do for 50 years. If you have to put up with a adulterer who pays off porn stars in the Oval Office or whatever, so be it. That's the way a lot of people view it. But it's a good question. I think we have time and time again thought, this is when people get off the Trump train, right? After Access Hollywood, they could get off the Trump train. After he insulted John McCain's war record, they'll get off the Trump train. After Charlottesville, they'll get off the Trump train. After January 6th, they'll get off the Trump train. After the midterm, they'll get off the Trump train. The train's still going. Now a lot of them are tired of him. I think that's true. I think that there are 3 big blocks in the Republican Party right now. One of them is not a not very big block, which is just the block that doesn't like him at all, right? The never Trumpers, as they're called. Maybe that's 10% of the Republican Party right now, 15%. And then there's a block about 30% that are just diehards, right? Just love him. He's the best. I'm with him no matter what, all the way. He's right. The election was stolen, everything. I think the rest are varying degrees of, we like Trump, we like a lot of things he did, I want a Republican in there, I can't stand the Democrats, Hillary Clinton is a disaster, Joe Biden is a doddering old socialist captive of the left, and I want a Republican in there, but I'm kind of tired of Trump. I'm kind of tired of him. And the question is, when does that fatigue become meaningful, right? When does that actually affect an election that Trump is in? We'll see. A lot of Republicans look at the midterm and say, look what happened. The people he picked are the ones who went down. We should have won that election. By history's standard, that should have been a Republican election in a much bigger way than it was. They did win the House, by the way. The Democrats, I think, go a little overboard saying they won. They didn't win. They lost the House, which is kind of a big deal, even if it was a narrow majority. But they beat the odds that history had set out, which is expecting a much bigger Republican tide. And, what Republicans will say is that Trump's picks are the ones who brought them down. If they hadn't had Herschel Walker in Georgia, if they hadn't had Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania, if they hadn't had, some of these people, the people in Arizona and so forth, they would have had the Senate. In fact, everybody who voted for a Republican House candidate in 2022 voted for the Senate candidate in their state, they would have won the Senate. But they didn't. A lot of people turned out. They voted for their Republican candidate for the House, and they couldn't bring themselves to vote for their Republican Senate candidate. Cost them the Senate. So you would think a lot of Republicans would say, hey, this isn't going so well for us. But it's just a visceral thing right now. And we'll see. I don't think it's a given he's going to win the nomination again, but I wouldn't bet against it either. He's competitive with DeSantis. I'm not sure DeSantis has been tested on a national level. He got a 19-point win in Florida, very impressive. That makes him a real contender. But it's still up in the air.
And just to kind of follow up on what we discussed before, in particular, maybe the one person we haven't mentioned, we mentioned secretaries of state, defense, DNIs, every high-level official under the sun, but we haven't mentioned Vice President Mike Pence, who some of you may have come to last week when we hosted him. But just in the broader picture, Mike asked, what was the rough percentage of true Trump believers in the administration? I suppose if you could give a percentage. And then someone else asked, they didn't put a name, as time went on, how did Mike Pence sleep at night? How did he justify serving quietly with Trump?
Well, did you ask him that last week?
Yeah.
I love to answer that one. Look, the percentage, I don't know percentage, but like a third maybe. I'm just guessing off the top of my head. I mean, most of the people who worked for him were not true believers. They did not think this was going all that well. They may have agreed him on this or that. Some of them, they were sometimes opportunistically using him to accomplish policy goals that they would have, preferred to pursue with another Republican president. But they thought that they could get, something done on their priorities. But I'd say a third of them maybe really believed in him in some real way, maybe. As for Pence, it's interesting. He's such an interesting character, right? Because for 3 years, 11 months, and however many days, he manages to avoid ever getting on the wrong side of Trump. He's the only one, practically, in the administration who didn't have some nasty tweet before January 6th, didn't have some sort of falling out with Trump, didn't have some sort of break with him. He had managed to navigate each and every time in some way or another. And he was a fascinating figure because if you asked his friends, people who talk with him in private say, well, okay, but in private, did he, wink and nudge and say, yeah, I get it, I know what's going on here, I have to deal with it? No. Even in private, he maintained that poker face. He never, ever admitted, even to people who he trusted, that he had any qualms about the Trump presidency until January 6th. He finally comes to a path in the road, a fork in the road he cannot navigate around. He cannot finesse it. He cannot overlook it, underplay. He can't, leave the Oval Office and hope nobody notices. Remember, on the Lafayette Square day, he carefully does not walk with him across Lafayette Square, right? But doesn't do it in a way that gets him in trouble. But finally, he has come to this fork in the road. There is no off-ramp. It's a yes or no, black or white, up or down choice. Which way are you going to go? And he makes his choice. He feels like he has no choice. And yet, to this day, and you probably, if you were here last week, heard him say it, he's very proud of the Trump administration. He's proud of a lot of the policies they put in place, and he will not say anything bad about former President Trump other than he was wrong on January 6th. And it's just a really fascinating story. I've never seen anything like it in politics.
And just two questions. We'll just, for the sake of time, we've got to wrap it up. Two questions related to Russia. One obviously goes back a bit further, but obviously you have a lot of familiarity with Russia and the United States. Michael asks, what was the opposition to inviting Russia to join NATO back in the 90s? And then maybe to put it in more recent history, what are your thoughts, someone else asked, what are your thoughts on Russian collusion and the attempt to take down Donald Trump?
Yeah. Well, on the part about Russia and NATO, a very famous Houstonian you guys all know, Secretary Baker, actually wrote an op-ed in the New York Times way back in the early 90s saying that they should offer NATO membership to Russia, or at least offer the possibility of NATO membership if Russia would meet the criteria the other countries had to offer, had to meet. And when we got there in 2000, end of 2000, early 2001, I remember there being a time when Putin even broached the idea that, maybe we should join NATO. But it was never a serious possibility. And, Russia did not want to be part of our club. That's not the way Putin looked at it. He looks at us and says, you guys are trying to establish a hegemonic, unipolar world where only you matter. Well, screw that. We're Russia. We're big. We're bad. We've been big and bad for a lot longer than you guys have, and we're not going to kowtow to you. And it's, I think it was, I don't know that it was inevitable that we get to this exact point in this exact way, but something like this was inevitable. He was never going to be our friend for a permanent basis. On the collusion question, on the question of, what Mueller found in his report, which is often missed, is an extraordinary set of evidence of contacts between President Trump, his people, and the Russians. Something we've never seen in any other American campaign that I can think of. What he didn't find was a criminal conspiracy that he could prove in court. That doesn't mean that there's not something there to be interested in, right? There's a difference between, hey, not illegal, and hey, good idea, right? And somewhere in between, we have a campaign that was pretty tied up with Russia for unknown reasons, or maybe for known reasons, we could guess, right? President Trump, as a candidate, says, Russia, if you're listening, hack into her computer. Guess what happened that same day? The Russians hacked into her computer. Now, did he mean that as a joke, as he said? Maybe, maybe not. But the Russians were listening. It was, at the very least, a signal to them that they took to mean, hey, this is a good idea, whether he meant it that way or not. His son and son-in-law and campaign manager took a meeting at Trump Tower with the Russians who said, we're here to give you dirt on Hillary Clinton as part of the Russian government's support for your candidacy. That's in writing. That's not a guesswork. That's in writing. Just because they didn't like the dirt that they were given and didn't think it was all that useful doesn't mean that it wasn't an attempt to collaborate, in effect, with the Russians. Again, that may not be a crime. That's what Mueller looked at. Is there a criminal statute that I can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, a reasonable doubt, in a court of law? That's different than, hey, something weird happened here, and we haven't really gotten an answer to it.
And just two questions. They kind of bring it back to the election and bring it back to where we are now. Someone asked, they didn't put a name, but what is your explanation for how Trump was elected, and what degree was it caused by failings of the establishment? A good question. And then TD asks, although he is a divider, how did he get 74 million votes? And maybe just in conclusion, because you've been watching the United States for a long time and presidencies, the unfortunate forces that have led to populists being elected all across the world and in our country too. They're part of what pushed Bernie Sanders to come close to winning the nomination. Of large parts of your population feeling left behind, feeling that we don't have a chance anymore. They're elites who run everything. I'm not well enough educated. I don't have the skills for this job. I need a savior, and I don't care if it's Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. I'm willing to give it a try. We haven't really addressed a lot of that. Where do you think we are now? And do you think there's a chance he could get elected again?
Yeah, I think that's all important. I think he tapped into some very real, important strains of American thought right now, which is that, yeah, the elites have screwed us. They have left us behind. They profit. They make money. We are stuck here. Our factories are closed, or what have you. Some of that is imagined, and some of that's real, right? Some of that's along lines of otherness, right? Other people are getting ahead and we're not. That could be race. That could be immigration. That can be East Coast versus the middle of the country. All the different lines that, are cleavages in our society. And those are real and genuine, sentiments that American politicians can't ignore without trying to figure out what to do about it. Because there is that. Now, I don't think it's very policy-oriented. I don't think it's, if only they passed this tax break, I'd be okay. It's a broader sense, right? It's a sense of dissatisfaction that the country is somehow getting away from us. And we've had that now for a while, right? If you look at the poll numbers, we haven't had a president who was popular since George W. Bush right after 9/11. All of Bush's second term, he was below 50% every single day. Barack Obama, a big spike at the very beginning, a big spike when he had the Osama bin Laden raid, but otherwise he was modest in the first term and even lower in the second term, below 50% almost his entire second term. Trump, below 50%, as you said, his entire presidency. Biden, for the last year and a half, below 50%. We are not happy with our leaders. There's something big and broad and important going on, and Trump is a manifestation of it, but he's not the cause of it, right? He happened to come along at a moment of polarization in our society and be the ultimate manifestation of it, because he is by nature a divider, which is why we use the term. He is the man who met the moment. But we are divided for all sorts of reasons. Why are we divided? We're divided because with fragmentation of the media, we all go off to our own corner of the internet or the cable channels and just listen to people who agree with us and tell us that we're right, right? We live increasingly separate from each other. We don't, if you look at it used to be in the 1980s that there would be roughly a third of the states would send a senator to Washington of a different party than the person they voted for president. In other words, they were willing to ticket split. Today, I think the last election, there was 1 or 0, I've forgotten exactly what it is, state that sent a different senator's party as the president. We are increasingly segregating ourselves physically and intellectually. There was a polling in the early 60s. Would it bother you if somebody in your family married, your daughter, your son, married somebody from the other party? And the answer is about 4 or 5% said yeah. Today it's closer to 50%, depending on the poll. I don't want no Republican coming to my house for Thanksgiving. I don't want no Democrats showing up for Christmas. We don't want to be with each other. Trump is perfect for that moment because that's his instinct. His instinct is to divide. He loves it. He said in the book, he says, I like conflict. I like conflict. He is the only president in my lifetime that I can think of, certainly in the 5 that I've covered, who didn't at least give the aspiration that it was the job of the president to bring us together and to represent all of us. Now, a president is also a member of a political party who has to divide in order to win elections. It's inherent in the system. He is both chief of state and chief of government. So we ask him to be a ceremonial leader bringing us together and a chief of government dividing us on policies. Okay. But at least every other president I covered gave voice to the idea that there was something noble in being president of all the people. George H.W. Bush said he wanted a kinder, gentler America, right? Bill Clinton said he wanted to be a repairer of the breach, citing Isaiah. George W. Bush said he wanted to be a uniter, not a divider. Barack Obama said we're not the blue states of America and the red states of America, we're the United States of America. Every president of our lifetime, or at least my lifetime, until President Trump came along, gave voice to that. They didn't always succeed. There were moments you could say they were very divisive, each of them, no question about it. They didn't always live up to that aspiration, but they at least gave voice to the aspiration. That's not Trump. Division is how he operates. That's how he rolls. He loves it. When he was running this Apprentice TV show, his idea for the 3rd or 4th season, because the ratings weren't necessarily going to be that great, was to let's have an all-white team versus an all-black team and go at it. Think about that. That is intentionally creating a race, conflict on his television show because it would be great ratings, he said. And NBC looked at him and said, no, we're not doing that. But that's how he rolls. And he has profited by doing that. That works for him. The question is whether it will work for him any further, whether we're finding a way around it, I don't know. But that is the defining question of our time.
All right, well, will you all please join me in thanking Peter Baker. Thank you.
Thank you guys very much. We appreciate it.